Hello and welcome to this very special broadcast coming to you from the International Media Center, where the Delhi G20 has now come to a conclusion. The gavel has been officially handed over to Brazil, which will be the next chair of the G20. So how will India's G20, how will the Delhi G20 Summit be remembered? Will it go down as historic? The fact that they've managed to get a joint declaration which has 8 paragraphs which talk about the war in Ukraine without any direct reference to Russia. The economic corridor, which has been announced between India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and France, Germany, and Italy, backed by the United States, will it be seen as a direct challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative? And of course, the historic inclusion of the African Union as the 21st member of the G20, or should we say the G21. We will assess what the Delhi G20 Summit actually achieved. All of that and more through the course of this special broadcast. I'm Zaka Jacob. But first, I want to play out for you the conclusion of the third and final session and how the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, concluded the Delhi edition of the G20 Summit.
जैसा आप सब जानते हैं, भारत के पास नवंबर तक G20 प्रेसिडेंसी की भी जिम्मेदारी है। अभी 2.5 महीने बाकी हैं। इन 2 दिनों में आप सभी ने अनेक बातें यहां रखी हैं, सुझाव दिए हैं, बहुत सारे प्रस्ताव रखे हैं। हमारी ये जिम्मेदारी है कि जो सुझाव आए हैं उनको भी एक बार फिर देखा जाए कि उनकी प्रगति में गति कैसे लाई जा सकती है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि हम नवंबर के अंत में G20 का एक वर्चुअल सेशन और रखें।
All right, so how will the Delhi G20 Summit be remembered? Will it go down as historic? To try and analyze all of this and more, I'm joined by Lisa Curtis. She's a senior fellow and the director of Indo-Pacific Security Program at CNAS. Asoke Mukerjea is former representative, permanent representative to the United Nations of the Government of India. Niranjan Hiranandani will be joining us from Hiranandani Group. And here in our studios, here in the live studios, we have with us Mr. Ehsan Bulaiga from Joata Business Development Council. Thank you very much for joining us. Lisa Curtis, let me start with you first. The Delhi G20 Summit, the fact that they managed to get a joint declaration, it has 8 paragraphs on the war in Ukraine without any direct reference to Russia. Do you see this as a success of India's diplomacy, success of India's negotiators, and will this go down after what we've seen through the course of the last 1 year, how deeply polarizing this war had become? The fact that negotiators managed to clinch a joint declaration, would this in and of itself qualify as historic for the Delhi G20 Summit?
Well, I think clearly this was a successful summit. You can see it in the comprehensive declaration, the fact that it dealt with everything from digital public infrastructure to empowering women and girls, to equitable, sustainable economic growth. The fact that they announced the rail and energy corridor from India through the Middle East to Europe, all of this points to a highly successful G20 summit. But, I think the fact that the statement was weaker on Ukraine than last year's Bali statement, actually that's the one disappointing factor. I think that the fact that Russia was not named means that, this was certainly a weaker statement. We've heard that from Ukrainian leaders. So, even though it was a very successful summit, it was disappointing that the language on Ukraine was not as strong. And I think, frankly, the U.S. and the other Western countries did a favor for India by allowing this language to be much weaker than it was a year ago. And hopefully that doesn't mean that there'll be less international support for Ukraine moving forward.
We'll also try and understand why such a thing came to pass, in the sense that why was the G7 allowing such a milder language to come through. But I want to go across to Asoke Mukerjea, who's been in the room in such hectic negotiations in the past as well. Till Friday night, Mr. Mukerjea, even the negotiators were not hopeful that they will be able to thrash out the paragraphs on the Ukrainian war. Yes, from 2 paragraphs in the Bali Declaration, they've got now 8 paragraphs, culminating with that famous sentence from the Prime Minister that this is not the era of war, this is the era of peace. But the criticism is that there's no direct mention of Russia. Do you believe that that's what clinched the deal? And how does India respond to this, as Lisa Curtis said, milder than Bali statement?
Well, Zaka, thank you for asking me on your show. I think that the key answer to your question is in that one sentence paragraph that this is not an era of war. I think that that is what propelled the discussions, the negotiations, the consensus. We heard the Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant, speak yesterday from the site of the negotiations on how the consensus was crafted. It required the cooperation of all the G20 members. So I think that including Russia, including China, including the G7, these being the 2 major parties, if I may call them, to the way the Ukraine issue was put into the declaration. But I think the end, this is not an era of war, is very important because of what the Prime Minister said today. That actually the responsibility for bringing peace is on the Security Council. And until the Security Council is reformed, there is no way any other body outside under international law can deal with bringing peace and ensuring this is not an era of war. In Ukraine and in other regions of the world, there are 52 conflicts going on as I speak, which are on the agenda of the Security Council, and it's helpless. So it has to be reformed. And I think that that is the key message, and that is the key objective of India's diplomacy in the next 2 years as we lead up to the 80th anniversary summit of the United Nations in 2025. And this is one big message that the success of Indian diplomacy in the Delhi G20 Summit has actually conveyed to the wider world, including the membership of the United Nations in New York.
Okay, I have with me Mr. Ehsan here. The fact that you represent a business council, the fact that you represent the voice of the Global South, and now you have the African Union that has been included as a permanent member of the G20, and possibly in Brazil in the next year when Brazil hosts the G20, you could have the Committee of Latin American Nations also included. How and why, from a business perspective, do you believe the inclusion of these newer members is important for the G20?
It's important for a number of reasons. One of them, it is a conflict reduction mechanism, if you think about it, because you'll have more people at the table discussing their own issues. If you remember, and I'm pretty sure that our viewers remember vividly, that in the various G20 summits, the African issues being there, either directly or indirectly, relevant to poverty, relevant to public debt, relevant to climate change, and so on and so forth. So it makes lots of sense. And I think it served the very important goal of the G20 to be more inclusive. So that's being inclusive, to have Africa there.
From a business point of view, now you have a new green climate initiative, you have the digital public infrastructure, which India has been a big proponent of, unified payment interface, financial transactions digitally done, so on. There is talk about regulating cryptocurrencies globally. From a business point of view, and particularly after 2.5, 3 years of COVID, and we're seeing slowdowns across the world, do you believe that this G20 has done enough to try and put the focus back on what it was meant to do originally, and that is to talk about business and economy and growth and moving the planet forward?
I think going through the declaration yesterday, a great deal of grounds being covered by this summit, really, and it started in a very good, positive, important milestone, which is the inclusion of the African Union, and also to make sure that the communique, as you mentioned in your first part, it smooth out a good language, and it is really a time of peace. It's not time of war. And that was very clear through the, in the sideline of the summit, where we have the corridor understanding through India, the Gulf, and Europe. So here, this is talking about things positively, achieving things, and that's inclusion, rather than wasting time, getting into disputes and then resolving the disputes. So this is the time of peace. And when we talk about economic development and growth, and this is all about, when you're talking about the G20, the global muscles of the global economy, then you need peace and you need stability, of course.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Ehsan. Thank you for your time. I also am joined by Niranjan Hiranandani of the Hiranandani Group. And a lot of focus, Mr. Hiranandani, has been on this infrastructure corridor that's been announced, this economic corridor, all the way from Asia to Arabia to Europa, as many are calling it. There has been sort of a lot of debate around these big infrastructure projects. We've seen Chinese debt, how smaller countries are getting affected by it. The question mark that always remains over these infrastructure projects is about debt financing. How will this be different from whatever else we've seen in the past, including the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, as they call it?
I think the most important thing is the fact that this economic corridor lays a new connectivity for India to be connected to the Middle East and Europe by a more efficient transport system. So benefit number one is the fact that India will benefit in terms of trade and other things, so that the transportation and other costs for the purposes of doing business with Europe and the Middle East will come down. I think that is the most important thing to see. Number two, the economic ideas which the Chinese moved into various countries of the world is sought to be neutralized by this proposition which has come up over here. Obviously, the corridor has to pay for itself, but there is no direct debt program which will actually affect them or take away the benefits of that, as has happened in other countries where China's have put their footprint into it. But the most important factor is the fact that the country's cooperation is between nations which now control 80% of the GDP of the entire world. So the G20, including the European Union, now controls 80% of the GDP of the entire world. So all the consensus which has come through the statement, as well as the dealings and businesses which have happened on the sidelines of G20, become even more important. So if you're talking about the understanding with the United States in terms of the engines, aircraft engines that we are talking about technology, about the manufacturing of chips, all these other factors are on the sidelines have happened, are actually double or triple the main manifesto which has come out in the open. So, and also the fact that the discussions on the sidelines with each of the countries has taken a big leap into a different corridor of business that is going to happen in the future. So I think India has taken big advantage of the fact that this declaration has been signed, accepted, and also the fact that this given an opportunity of all the leaders in the world to set up new benchmarks of economics and business, which is a different ballgame completely. And the geopolitical leadership of India is now completely recognized.
Yeah. Asoke Mukerjea, I'm sure even in your time in the service, we were talking about this North-South Corridor project. We were talking about Chabahar in Iran. With the announcement of this economic corridor yesterday between the Gulf countries and all the way to Western Europe, are we now putting a lid on this whole North-South corridor? And of course, there are geopolitical issues with Iran beyond the control of India, as a result of which Chabahar hasn't exactly taken off the way India was hoping it would. So are we putting a lid on that project, the North-South corridor project?
I think that the project that was announced yesterday by a group of countries in the G20 meeting for a rail link from India across the Arabian Sea to UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and onwards to Europe is a supplement to the connectivity between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. The existing connectivity is through the Swiss Canal. And I think that I'm sure that the proponents of this new project have kept in mind that you cannot really bypass or erase the Swiss Canal, because in sheer volume, the sea lanes of communication of the Western Indo-Pacific carry a huge amount of trade that goes from India to the West and that comes from the West to India. So we would not be shooting ourselves in the feet by submerging the Suez Canal and only focusing on this railway link. The second point is that the north-south connectivity, if you recall, was to connect Helsinki to Singapore. That was how eventually it evolved in 2006, 2007, when the situation in Eurasia was very different from what it is today. So whether the viability of the north-south transport corridor in terms of the cargo carried, the volumes, the profits to be made by the companies, etc., whether all those factors remain as they were 10 years ago or not, I think is an open question. We have had the first activization of the north-south transport corridor, and ironically enough, this was cargo from Russia to Saudi Arabia that used the north-south transport corridor. So the corridor exists. Now, what use the corridor is put to, it depends on the countries which are parties to the north-south transport corridor. The Chabhar project was focused on Afghanistan. And it's very unfortunate that in the middle of all these discussions of the G20, we have not even given one word on Afghanistan and on the fact that half the population of Afghanistan has been deprived of its human rights. I think it's a real pity that nobody had time to even mention this. Thank you.
I want to ask Lisa Curtis this, and I come back to where we started about what you call the dilution of language, specifically with reference to Russia and its war in Ukraine. Two things. One, if they couldn't come to a common language acceptable to all parties, then there would be no joint declaration. And no matter what other outcomes the Delhi summit achieved, this would be the headline that no joint declaration, and therefore, the first summit in the history of the G20 to not come to a joint declaration. So was there a realization within the Western countries, particularly the United States itself, that they cannot afford for India and the India-hosted G20 summit to fail? And is that perhaps why they agreed to what you're calling a dilution of language?
I think that's right. I think the United States and the other countries that have been very supportive of Ukraine realized that it was extremely important that this G20 summit be a success. I think they all wanted to show support for India's leadership role. The fact that, President Biden was there and had such a positive attitude, the fact that Prime Minister Modi and President Biden had this very productive meeting. I think all of this shows that the U.S. and the other countries wanted to support India. And unlike President Xi, who didn't bother to show up at the meeting, they have shown that India's leadership is important, that India is a bridge to the global south, and they wanted to show this. And I think that's right. That is why the language was softer. They wanted to make sure that there was an agreement. And there are so many positive things that have come out of this meeting, and so much hard work by India over the last 8-9 months in the run-up to getting this work done. And so it is important that that wasn't overshadowed, and that China was not allowed to hold up this moment in the sun for India.
All right. Lisa Curtis, Asoke Mukerjea, and Niranjan Hiranandani, thank you so much for joining us on this special broadcast, coming to you from the Media Center, the International Media Center here at the Bharat Mandapam.